The map had no name for that space. Every star, every nebula, every dead rock floating in the dark had been cataloged, named, tagged with coordinates so precise you could drop a ship within arm's reach of any moon in the known galaxy. The Veth Collective had spent 600 years building this map. Other species had contributed too. The Durathi had added their section of the outer rim. The Kavari had mapped the deep spiral arms. Even the reclusive of Marin had given up coordinates for their 3 home systems grudgingly after years of careful diplomacy. The map covered everything except one section. Kes stood in the map room of the Collective's central archives and stared at it. The blank space wasn't small. It wasn't some forgotten corner of the outer edge. It sat roughly in the middle of the galactic disk, a patch of nothing where something clearly was. Stars existed there. Gravity readings confirmed it. The light coming from that direction confirmed it. There was matter there. Were systems, there were almost certainly planets. But the map said nothing. No coordinates, no names, no survey data, not even a warning label. Just white space, and a thin line around it that every civilization in the known galaxy had agreed, without ever formally agreeing, never to cross. "You're looking at it again," said Prith. Kes didn't turn around. Prith was her assistant, 12 years younger, deeply practical and constitutionally incapable of leaving things alone. She heard him cross the room and stopped beside her. "You do this every time you get a difficult assignment," he said. "This assignment is different." Silence. She heard him breathe. "Hold it." "No," he said. "Yes. Guess. The Directorate has requested a formal diplomatic contact mission." She kept her voice flat, bureaucratic, the voice she used for things she had already decided. Trade route negotiations. They want access to the third arm transit corridor. The shortest path goes through. She gestured at the white space. Prith made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a Veth makes when they are too alarmed to form language properly. "We are not going in there," he said. Once he found words again. "We are going to the border to request a meeting." "Nobody requests meetings with." He stopped, lowered his voice as if the archive walls had ears. "Maybe they did. Nobody does that. Someone has to. The transit corridor saves 4 months of travel time for half the Collective's trade fleet. 4 months Prith per trip. The economics alone. Do you know what happened to the Durathi survey team? They went missing. They went missing inside human space." He stressed those last 2 words the way you stress the words open flame or active volcano. 12 ships, 48 crew, completely standard survey mission, no weapons, full diplomatic flags. They went in and they came back. One ship came back. One. He paused. The pilot wouldn't talk about it. For 3 years she said nothing. Then she talked about it once to a directorate review board, and the entire record was sealed the same day. She retired, moved somewhere very quiet, has not spoken publicly since. That was 80 years ago. Humans have not changed in years. This was, Kes knew, probably true. The small amount of existing data on humans suggested they changed constantly, in unimportant ways, and not at all in the ways that mattered. They were, from what anyone could determine, exactly as they had been when they first showed up in Galactic records, unexpected, loud, and extremely difficult to predict. She turned away from the map. Prith was looking at her the way younger people look at someone they respect who is about to do something inadvisable. Worried, faintly impressed, mostly. Worried. Pack light, she said. We leave in 6 days. The briefing packet on humans was not long. This was not because humans were simple. It was because the data was sparse and most of what existed was either old, unverified, or, in 14 specific cases, classified at a level KIST did not have clearance to reach. She read what she could on the transit to the border. Humans had been formally discovered by the wider galaxy approximately 300 years ago, though discovered was perhaps the wrong word because the humans had already discovered themselves in several of their neighbors and had been sending signals into deep space for centuries before the collective made first contact. They communicated constantly on every frequency about everything. Their early broadcasts were a wall of noise, art, arguments, music, mathematics, what appeared to be cooking instructions, something that was either religious, ritual, or competitive sport, or possibly both at the same time. First contact had been managed by the Kavari, who were patient and careful, and had managed worse situations before. The initial meeting had gone reasonably well. Humans were curious, friendly, and deeply interested in trade. Then things had gotten complicated. Nobody in the briefing packet used the word war, but the language around certain periods was careful in the way language gets careful when nobody wants to say the obvious thing out loud. Disagreement, territorial dispute, misunderstanding with significant casualties. 4 different species had, at various points in the last 3 centuries, tried to test the limits of human patience and human tolerance. None of them tried it a second time. The Veth Collective had never been directly involved. They were traders, administrators, the quiet managers of the galaxy. They built maps, they maintained records, they negotiated transit fees and filing deadlines. They did not pick fights with anyone. This had served them extremely well for a very long time. It had also meant that Kess, after 15 years in diplomatic service, knew almost nothing about humans from direct experience. Everything she knew came from other people's reports, other people's notes, other people's careful and sometimes frightened words. She knew the basics. Humans were bipedal, relatively small by galactic standards. They breathed oxygen, drank liquid water, ate an almost comically wide range of organic matter. They were warm-blooded, which explained some of their restlessness. She knew they were social, intensely social. They formed bonds constantly with each other, with other species, and reportedly with non-sentient animals. They kept inside their homes as companions. The Kavari contact specialist who'd written the original report had spent 3 full pages being baffled by this last detail. She knew they were creative. They produced art in quantities that strained archival systems, music, paintings, written stories, built structures, things that didn't translate cleanly into any other species categories. Some of it had made its way into the wider galaxy. Kess owned a piece of human music that she played sometimes when she couldn't sleep. She had told no one this, and she knew this part came near the back of the packet in smaller font, as if whoever wrote it had quietly hoped it would go unnoticed that humans had a particular quality that every species that had encountered them had eventually, reluctantly documented. They did not stop. Not when they were losing, not when logic said stopping was the smart choice, not when the cost of continuing was clearly, mathematically greater than the cost of accepting defeat. They continued anyway, they adapted, they found angles that weren't supposed to exist and hit from those angles instead. They remembered everything. They held grudges across generations with a patience that other species found, depending on their perspective, admirable, troubling, or simply exhausting. The Marin had a word for it that translated roughly as the quality of a rock that keeps rolling even after it had stopped. The Durathi called it the long anger. The Kavari, who had the most direct experience of all, had a word that didn't translate at all, but the gesture that went with it translated just fine. A small shudder, quickly controlled, which meant some things are better not fully named. Cass set the briefing packet on the seat beside her. Outside the ship's window, the stars were thinning, the mapped galaxy dense with cataloged light was slowly giving way to something that looked almost the same but felt different. Emptier or not. Emptier, fuller maybe, with something that didn't register on standard instruments and didn't show up on any scan. They were close to the edge of the map, the line nobody had ever formally drawn, and everybody knew was there. The border station was called Threshold 9. It was not officially a border station. According to collective records, it was a transit monitoring post, but everyone who worked there called it the border station, and everyone who arrived there understood exactly what it was. The border of the station was old, the kind of old that builds up like sediment at the bottom of a slow river, layers of repair over old repair. New equipment crammed into rooms built for different equipment. The walls were 4 different colors in 4 different sections, each color representing a renovation that had stopped when someone ran out of materials or motivation. It smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and faintly something Cass couldn't quite identify, something that might have been long-term, low-grade fear. The staff processed her credentials efficiently and without warmth. They moved with the practiced blankness of people who have learned very deliberately not to react to the thing they are not reacting to. The station commander was a Veth named Orath. He had been stationed here for 11 years. He had the look of someone who had originally planned to stay for 2. He met Kess in his office. It was a small room. The single window faced very deliberately away from human space. "Ambassador," he said. "Commander Orath, I need a communication channel to the Human Border Authority. I know what you need, no hostility in it, just weight, the weight of a man who has seen this exact conversation before. I received the Directorate's brief. Then you know this mission is authorized at the highest level." "I know it's authorized." A pause. "Authorization isn't the same as wisdom." Cass waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Is there a problem with the communication equipment?" she asked. "No, the equipment works fine." He looked at his desk. "The humans have a station on their side about 4 light minutes out from the line. They respond to incoming communication requests usually within the hour." "Usually." Sometimes they answer immediately. He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes they make you wait. You never know which it will be on any given day. That seems manageable. Yes, said in the tone of a person confirming a fact they find personally inconvenient. They're very manageable. In some ways, he stood signaling the meeting was ending. I'll open the channel for you, but Ambassador. She waited. Whatever they say to you, however they say it, he met her eyes directly. Don't let them make things feel normal. They are extremely good at making things feel normal when they absolutely are not. Cass looked at him. What does that mean specifically? Orith was quiet for a moment. Outside, the window that faced away from human space, the mapped stars burned in the dark, neat and catalogued and safe. You'll understand when you get there, he said. Everyone does. The communication request went out at the 14th hour. The response came back in 20 minutes. Cass was ready at the console. Notes. Arranged formal opening statement. Prepared preliminary questions listed. Authorization codes on hand. She had conservatively 12 different ways to begin this conversation depending on how the other side opened. The screen lit up. The human on the other side was leaning back in a chair that looked like it might give out under him at any moment. He was wearing something that was probably a uniform. Cass registered a badge, a logo, some kind of insignia on the shoulder, but the sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and there was an object on the desk beside him that was either a beverage or a minor safety hazard. His hair went in 3 directions at once. He looked in total like a man who had recently been very busy with something completely unrelated to receiving diplomatic transmissions. He looked at her. She looked at him. He grinned. Hey, he said. Cass had prepared 12 opening statements. None of them started with hey. She looked at her notes back at him. Greetings, she said. I am Ambassador Cass, representing the Veth Collective. I am contacting the station to formally request a diplomatic meeting regarding proposed transit access to the third arm corridor specifically. Yeah, we got the summary brief. He picked up his beverage, drank, set it down. You want transit rights through the corridor? That is correct. Makes sense, saves a lot of travel time. He shrugged. Simple as that. I'll push it up to someone senior. They'll reach out about setting up a formal meeting. He tilted his head, looking at her with easy, uncalculated curiosity. You ever come inside our space before? I have not. Huh, he seemed to think about this without any particular concern. You'll probably be fine. Cass made careful note of the word probably. Is there a specific reason I might not be fine? He made a gesture she couldn't quite read, a kind of loose wave that might have meant who knows, or hard to say, or possibly don't lose sleep over it. Nah, he said, most people are fine. There's an adjustment period coming in. But you seem like the kind of person who handles adjustments well. What kind of adjustment specifically? He smiled again. It was the smile of someone who was genuinely not worried about the thing she was worried about, for reasons she had not yet been given access to. You'll see, he said. The screen went dark. Cass sat alone in the communications room of Threshold 9. The recycled air hummed. The station vibrated slightly, as it always did, with the subtle sound of old machinery doing its job. She thought about the white space on the Map. She thought about the Durathi pilot who came back alone and stayed silent for 3 years. She thought about You'll See, delivered twice in one day by 2 people standing on opposite sides of the most significant uncrossed line in the known galaxy. Then she gathered her notes, stood up, and went to find Prith. "We're going in," she said. He made the sound again, the one that wasn't quite a word. "Start packing," she told him, and Prith. He looked at her with the eyes of a man already reconsidering every decision that had led him to this moment. "Pack for surprises," she said. The line wasn't marked. Cass had expected something, a beacon, maybe a signal buoy, some physical indicator that said, "This is the place. Here is where the known galaxy ends and something else begins." There was nothing. One moment they were in map space, coordinates ticking over on the navigation console, every star tagged and named and filed, and then the numbers changed and the tags disappeared and the stars became just stars again, anonymous and unnamed, belonging to nobody's records. Prith noticed the moment the console went blank. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the empty coordinate field for a long time, the way you look at a door that was locked yesterday and is open today, trying to figure out whether that's good news or very bad news. "Still there?" Kes asked without looking up from her notes. "Still here," he said, a beat, barely. The human station came into view 6 hours later. It was smaller than Kes had expected. She'd imagined something imposing, a military structure bristling with sensors designed to project the kind of presence that said, "Turn around, you don't want to be here." She'd built up a picture in her head from the briefing data from Orath's window that faced deliberately away from the sealed Durathi record. She'd imagined the physical architecture of a warning. What she saw was a station that looked, honestly, a little tired. It was functional, clean probably on the inside. The docking bays were well maintained, but it had the same feel as Threshold 9, the same sense of a structure that'd been here longer than anyone originally planned, quietly doing its job while everyone forgot to make it look important. Lights blinked in standard docking sequence. An ordinary welcome. "They want us to dock at Bay 4. Prith said. He was reading from the console with the careful attention of a person who is glad to have a task. "Then we dock at Bay 4, Kes said. The customs officer's name was Reyes. She was waiting for them at the end of the docking corridor, a small human woman in a uniform that fit well but wasn't trying to impress anyone, dark hair pulled back, a badge clipped at the chest, a data tablet in one hand and in the other a ceramic cup that was clearly warm because she was holding it with both hands when she wasn't using the tablet. She looked at them when they stepped out. "Ambassador Kes," she said. "Yes." "Welcome," she said it the way you say welcome to someone you're genuinely glad to see, not the way you say it as a formality. It was a small thing, Kes noted it. "I'm Officer Reyes, Border Authority, 3rd Armed Transit Division. I'll be processing your entry today." She looked at Prith. "And you're Prith, assistant to the ambassador." He said it very correctly, very formally. The voice of someone who is using professionalism as a life raft. "Great," Reyes smiled at him. It was a completely normal smile, and Prith looked like it had personally alarmed him. "If you both follow me, we'll get the Entry paperwork sorted, and you can be on your way. They followed her. The corridor was plain and well lit. Cass looked at everything, the walls, the floor markings, the small signs. Posted at intervals, she couldn't read the language yet, but the translator would handle that once it calibrated to local usage. One sign had a picture of a cup with a line through it, which presumably meant no beverages, which Ray's was visibly ignoring. Prith was also looking at everything. He was doing it with slightly more anxiety than Kess, his eyes moving fast. Cataloging. He'd been doing this since they crossed the line, taking mental notes the way a person takes mental notes when they feel they might need to describe this place to someone later at speed under pressure. How long is the entry process usually? Kez asked. For a diplomatic visit, about an hour. Ray's glanced back at her. Most of it's just verification, confirming your credentials, logging your ship standard. Health check, nothing invasive. And we'll set you up with a translator that covers our main regional dialects, since I'm guessing you're headed to the capital for your meetings. That's correct. Good call going to the capital. Transit people are based there. They'll be the ones you actually negotiate with. She pushed open a door and held it for them. I'll be honest, this corridor took forever to approve on our side, too. Some people on the council kept arguing about letting anyone through at all, and some other people kept saying the economic case was too obvious to ignore. And it went back and forth for about 8 months before someone just called a vote and moved on. Kess looked at her. There was internal debate about this. Oh, sure. There's always internal debate. Ray set down her cup on a desk and pulled up the entry form on her tablet. We're not exactly a simple bureaucracy, more like several bureaucracies stapled together and told to cooperate. She said it without any particular frustration, just the easy tone of someone describing a familiar landscape. Anyway, the vote came through. Your directorate sent the formal request, and here we are. She held out the tablet. If you can authorize here, and initial at the bottom, that handles the first section. Cass took the tablet. She read through it carefully, which she always did, and authorized and initialed and handed it back. Ray's did something on the tablet. Prith, I'll need the same from you. She handed it over. You listed yourself as administrative support. Yes, Prith said. Perfect. She leaned against the desk while he worked through it. So this is your first time inside our space? For both of us, Cass said. Cool. Ray said it like a noise, not quite a word. Is it what you expected? Cass thought about Orith's window, about the sealed Dorathi record, about Prith's wordless sound of alarm deployed multiple times in the last 6 days. Not entirely, she said. Ray's nodded as if this were the expected answer. We get that a lot. People come in expecting. She paused, seeming to search for the right word. More, I guess it's just space. We're just people. She took her tablet back from Prith. Though I will say, if you have time after your meetings, the capital is worth seeing. Good food, good architecture, and the transit team has a tradition of visiting diplomats to dinner, which sounds formal but is actually just going to a restaurant and arguing about sports for 2 hours while someone else picks up the bill. Prith looked at Cass. Cass looked at Prith. Neither of them had been briefed on the dinner tradition. That sounds, Cass started. Normal, Ray supplied cheerfully. Yeah. It is, that's kind of the point, she finished with the tablet and set it face down. Okay, health check next. It's completely non-invasive, just a scan. Takes about 30 seconds, confirms you're not carrying anything that would be a problem in our biosphere and vice versa. Standard protocol. She gestured toward a room off the main office. They went. The health check took exactly 30 seconds. Then there was a form about the ship's cargo. Cass had brought the standard diplomatic kit, nothing remarkable, and this was verified without drama. Then a form about their planned duration of stay. Then a form about communication devices, which had to be registered locally for the period of the visit. All of it was straightforward, professional, boring in the best possible sense. Cass had handled customs procedures on 12 different worlds. This one was unremarkable in every practical way, which was itself remarkable, though she was still working out exactly why. While Reyes was printing something, physically printing it on what appeared to be actual material, which Cass found interesting, Prith leaned very slightly toward Cass and said very quietly, "There's a plant." Cass looked at him. He nodded with his eyes toward the corner of the room. There was in fact a plant, a small one, in a round container on the windowsill. Green, several leaves, a small tag stuck into the soil that presumably gave it a name. "I see it," Cass murmured. "It's not doing anything," Prith said. "Plants generally don't." "I know, he stopped. He looked at the plant. The plant was indeed doing nothing, growing slowly in the way plants do, at a speed no one could perceive in real time. "It's fine," he said, mostly to himself. Reyes came back with the printed materials and didn't seem to notice this exchange, or if she did, she was too polite to acknowledge it. "Okay," she said, sliding a folder across the desk toward Cass. "Entry documentation, registration for your communication devices, contact information for the border authority, office in the capital in case you have any issues, and a map." She tapped the folder. "Physical map, I know. Old-fashioned, but signal coverage does some weird things in certain parts of the city, and it's nice to have a backup." Cass opened the folder. The map was detailed, clear streets labeled, landmarks noted, the transit department building marked with a small symbol, and in the upper right corner, just a small thing not even meant to be notable, was a wider map, a regional overview showing the surrounding space, showing the border they'd crossed, and on the other side of the border, where Threshold 9 was, where the collective space began, where 600 years of careful cataloging lived. The map was blank, not labeled Veth collective space, not labeled neighboring territories, not labeled anything, just blank, the way her map was blank on the other side. Cass stared at it. "That's interesting," she said. Reyes looked at what she was looking at. "Oh, the regional overview. Your maps also leave the surrounding space unlabeled." "Yeah." Reyes picked up her cup again, drank, set it down. "We don't really map outside our space in detail. Figured if other people wanted us to have their coordinates, they'd give them to us." Small shrug. "Mostly they haven't." Cass thought about this. The blank space on the galactic map, the one everyone had agreed, without agreeing, never to enter, and here on the human side, a corresponding blankness, not fear, not warning. Just, if you want us to know where you Or tell us you haven't. So we left it empty. She put the map back in the folder. Everything looks to be in order, she said. Great, Ray smiled. Your ship is cleared. For the duration, the transport to the capital leaves from Bay 7 in about 2 hours. I'd recommend that over flying your own ship into the capital zone. Parking is a nightmare there. Transit people will meet you at the arrival's point. She paused. Any questions? Cass had approximately 40 questions. She selected one. The communication we had from Threshold 9. The officer who answered, is there a way to send confirmation that we arrived without incident? Ray looked at her for just a moment. Something in her expression shifted very slightly, not a big change, but something. Sure, she said, I can log an arrival confirmation through official channels. It'll reach your border station. Thank you. Of course. She picked up her tablet, again signaling they were done. Bay 7, 2 hours. The transport staff will know who you are. Safe travels, Ambassador. She said it simply, easily, the way you say safe travels to someone headed somewhere perfectly ordinary. Cass picked up the folder and walked back out into the corridor with Prith at her shoulder. They found a small waiting area near Bay 7 and sat. Prith held his copy of the documentation folder on his knees and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. She had a plant, he said eventually. I noticed. In a customs office. He seemed to be working through something, just a little plan on the windowsill. People put plants in their offices. Cass said. I know, it's just he stopped, tried again. I've been afraid of this for 6 days. Since you said we were going, I've been thinking about the Durathi pilot and the sealed records and Orith and his window. And I've been trying to prepare myself. For I don't know something. He looked at her. And it's just a station, he said. With a plant and a woman who's annoyed about the parking situation in the capital. Cass said nothing. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse, Prith said. I know, Cass said. Because she was thinking the same thing. She had also been preparing for something that matched the fear she'd seen on Orith's face in the briefing package's careful language, the galaxy's unspoken agreement to draw a line and call it a mapping gap. She had been ready in whatever way a diplomat can be ready for something that pushed back. Instead, she had gotten Rays who drank from a ceramic cup and was tired of council debates and thought the restaurant dinner was a good tradition. And that was the part she couldn't place. Yet the part that sat just sideways of her understanding, the way a sound sits at the edge of hearing, present, significant, not yet resolved. They were friendly. The humans were genuinely, straightforwardly friendly, and nothing about their friendliness was performance, or calculation, or diplomatic courtesy. It was simply how they were. Rays hadn't been trying to disarm Kess. She had just been herself in a customs office doing her job. And the galaxy had drawn a line around them and left it blank on every map. There was a reason for that. There had to be a reason for that. 12 Durathi ships and 1 pilot who came back and wouldn't speak. 4 species that tested the limit once and never tried again. 80 years of sealed records and carefully chosen words in every briefing document ever written that hadn't come from nothing. Friendly, Kess thought, genuinely, completely friendly. She watched a human maintenance worker cross the far end of the bay pushing a Cart of equipment whistling something. Not paying attention to her at all, not performing anything, just going about. His afternoon. And the things she'd read in the briefing, the long anger, the cavalry. Shudder, the word the Marin used for a rock that keeps rolling, settled into a new shape in her mind. It wasn't that the humans were dangerous, the way an armed weapon is dangerous. It was that they were exactly this. Exactly as she was seeing them now. Open, warm, practical, interested in restaurants and sports and little plants. On window sills, and they had still, when pushed, done things that made four different spacefaring civilizations decide that testing them twice was an experiment not worth running. Both things were true at the same time. The warmth was real. Whatever was underneath, it was also real. And you only found out about the second thing if you were foolish enough to go looking for it. Cass closed her folder. 2 hours until the transport. Outside the viewport, the unnamed stars of human space burned in the dark, uncatalogued, untagged, belonging to no one's official records but their own. She thought we drew the line because we were afraid, and they left their side blank because they simply didn't need to know. There was a difference between those two things. She was beginning to understand what the difference was. The transport came in low over the Capitol, and Cass pressed her face to the window like she was 12 years old. She had seen cities before. She had diplomatic experience on 9 worlds. She had walked through the glass towers of the Durathi financial district and the carved stone warrens of the Marin homeworld and the floating platforms that the Cavalry called a city, though it barely resembled one by anyone else's definition. She had not seen anything that looked like this. The human capital spread across the landscape the way water spreads, not planned outward from a center, not built upward in orderly columns, but sprawling, reaching, filling every available space, and then finding more space to fill. Old buildings beside new ones, towers beside low structures that looked centuries older. Green pressed in everywhere, parks, rooftop gardens, trees lining every road, as if the city and the landscape were in a negotiation that neither side was winning. And the people, even from this height, she could see them moving in the streets below like something alive in its own right, a separate organism, the city itself breathing. "It's loud," Prith said. The window was sealed. No sound came through. "You can't hear it yet," Cass said. "I can tell," he said, "from looking at it. It's going to be loud." He was right. When they stepped off the transport and into the arrivals terminal, the sound hit them like a wall. Voices, machinery, music from somewhere she couldn't identify, feet on hard flooring, an announcement in a language her translator was still calibrating to. It wasn't aggressive noise. It was simply the noise of a very large number of people going about their business with full commitment. Prith went very still in the way small animals go still when they feel something large nearby. "Keep moving," Cass said quietly. He kept moving. Director Vasquez was waiting at the edge of the arrivals area, holding a sign with Cass's name on it. This also surprised her. She had expected a delegation, a formal receiving line, at minimum a banner. Vasquez was a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and the kind of face that looked like it had been through several things and come out the other side with its sense of humor intact. Alongside him stood a younger woman who introduced herself as Obi, his deputy, and who was already reading something on a handheld device and didn't look up when she said hello, which somehow managed to be completely rude and completely natural at the same time. Ambassador, Vasquez shook her hand. The human greeting gesture she had read about this with the straightforward grip of someone who has shaken many hands and does not overthink it. Good travel. Smooth, Kes said. Great, the residence is about 20 minutes from here. We figured you'd want to settle before dinner, but if you're not tired, the walk through the central district is worth it, better than taking a vehicle. We can walk, Kes said. Vasquez looked at Prith. He okay? Prith was standing perfectly upright, with his documentation folder held against his chest and his eyes moving in steady arcs, left, right, left, right. Cataloging. He's fine, Cass said. He catalogs things when he's adjusting to a new environment. Cataloging's good, Vasquez said with the easy acceptance of a man who has learned not to question other species' coping strategies. Obi catalogs too, mostly complaints. But still, Obi looked up from her device. I heard that. I know. He picked up one of their bags before anyone offered it to him. This way. They walked. The city arranged itself around Cass as she moved through it, and she let it, taking in details the way she always took in new environments, not trying to understand everything at once, just letting impressions land and settle. The humans around her were varied in every physical sense, height, shape, coloring, dress, in a way that she hadn't quite expected from the briefing. Data. Other species tended toward relative uniformity. Veth looked like Veth. Darasi looked like Darasi, but the humans on the street looked almost like a collection of different peoples who had at some point decided to be one people anyway. She couldn't tell why this struck her as significant. It just did. They stopped at a crossing to wait for the traffic signal, and a human child next to Cass looked up at her with the specific bold curiosity that small humans apparently had no mechanism for suppressing. You're not from here, the child said. No, Cass said. Where are you from? Far away. The child considered this with great seriousness. How far? Very. The signal changed. The child's accompanying adult said something, and they moved on, the child still looking back over their shoulder at Kes until they disappeared into the crowd. Vasquez appeared at her elbow. Sorry about that, kids here are. It was fine, Kes said, and it had been. They're not taught to be cautious about outsiders. They're taught to be polite and not run into traffic, Vasquez said. The caution comes later if it comes. He said the last part without any particular weight, but Kes filed it. The central square was large and paved with pale stone that had been worn smooth by what must have been, given its surface, centuries of feet. At the far end stood a monument. It was not the largest thing in the square. There were buildings taller, a fountain closer to the center that drew more immediate attention. But Kes's eyes went to the monument and stayed there. It was a single vertical column, dark stone rising to a clean point. Around its base, words were cut into the stone in deep relief. On its face, a single image, not a figure, not a symbol she recognized, just a shape, an abstract form that might have been a wave or a hand or the edge of something much larger cut off. She looked at it. What is that? She asked. Vasquez glanced at it. Something in his expression did what Orth had done in his office, a slight adjustment. Not grief, not quite. Which part? He said. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. It's a memorial, he said. There was a period couple of centuries ago when we were still mostly confined to this planet where things got very bad. Conflict, resources, climate, it came at us from several directions at once. He put his hands in his pockets. We lost about a third of the planetary population over about 60 years. Cass looked at him. A third, she said. Yeah, of your entire population. At the time, he looked at the monument with the expression of someone who has looked at it many times. The words at the base are from a document that got written near the end of that period. It's basically a record of everything that went wrong and everything that was decided going forward. A pause. We put the monument here because this is where the people who wrote it met. The square used to be a ruin. Cass looked at the smooth stone under her feet, at the fountain, at the buildings pressing close on every side, full of glass and life, an ordinary human afternoon. And then you rebuilt, she said. We had a lot of arguments about how. Vasquez said, still do honestly, but yeah. He said it simply, matter-of-factly, not as a boast, not as a performance of resilience, just as a thing that happened, and then the next thing happened, and here they were in the square. Prith had been standing very quietly at Cass's shoulder. She could feel him not saying anything with significant effort. Obi, who had been scrolling through her device, looked up at the monument too. My grandmother used to say this city smelled like stubbornness, she said. I thought she meant it as a complaint. Nobody said anything for a moment. Didn't she? Vasquez asked. She might have. Obi went back to her device. She grew up here. She probably had a right. They walked on. The residence was comfortable, a clean set of rooms that had clearly been set up with non-human guests in mind. The furniture was adjustable. The lighting had settings. There was a document on the table listing which local food items were safe for vet biology and which were not, organized clearly and without condescension. Someone had also put a small plant on the windowsill. Prith looked at it for a long moment. They all have plants, he said. Apparently, Cass said. Is that a cultural thing? I don't know yet. He sat down, still holding his folder. Do you want me to research it? Later. Cass sat across from him. Tell me what you've been cataloging. He looked at his notes, actual handwritten notes, which was his habit when he was processing something quickly. The city is very old in some parts and very new in others, and they seem to treat this as normal. The infrastructure is clearly maintained, but also clearly constantly being added to. I counted 4 active construction sites. Just on our walk, they build while they're living in a place not before. Yes. The people are. He paused, relaxed in a way I can't fully account for. There's a lot of them in a very small space, and they seem fine with that. They don't give each other much room physically, and it doesn't seem to bother them. Social species, Cass said. Very. He looked at his notes. Monument. Cass waited. A third, he said, of their entire population in 60 years, and they stayed on the planet. They didn't disperse. They didn't request assistance. They just kept going, Cass said. He looked at her, yes. She looked out the window, the city. Moved outside it, ordinary and enormous. Full of the descendants of people who had lost a third of everything and rebuilt a square where a ruin had been. I think, Cass said slowly, that we have been afraid of the wrong thing. Prith waited. Everyone in the collective talks about humans as if they are a military threat, as if the danger is that they will come. For us, start something, push outward. She kept looking at the city, but they haven't in 300 years, every conflict they've been in started because someone else pushed first. Someone went into their space without permission. Someone tested the limit. The Dorathi survey team, Prith said. Quietly, the survey team went into human space without prior contact or clearance. Cass said, I checked the official record says missing. The earlier draft of the report, which I was able to access, says they entered without notification, and the humans responded as if they were. She stopped. As if they were what? Prith said. As if they were a threat. A pause. The humans don't make a distinction between a survey ship and any other ship. To them, an unannounced vessel crossing their border without contact is an unannounced vessel crossing their border without contact. The fact that it's carrying researchers and not weapons is not their problem, Prith said. Not visible to them, Cass said, from the outside without communication. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the city, something was playing music. It drifted up faintly, something with a strong rhythm, something that sounded like it was meant to be listened to, with a lot of other people around. The Dorathi pilot, Prith said, the one who came back. Yes. What do you think she saw? Cass thought about the sealed record. About 3 years of silence, about a woman who retired somewhere, very quiet. I think she saw what happens when you cross into someone's home without knocking, Cass said, and she saw it up close enough that she didn't have the words for it afterward, or she had the words and decided they weren't hers to share. Prith was quiet for a moment. We're having dinner with them tonight, he said. Yes. He looked at his notes, then at the plant on the windowsill. They're going to argue about sports, he said. That's what Ray's said. And we're going to sit there while they argue about sports, he said, knowing what we know about that monument and that record and the long anger and all of it. Yes, Cass said. He thought about this. I think, he said carefully, that might actually be the most frightening part. Cass said nothing because he was right, and saying so didn't seem like it would help either of them. Dinner was exactly what Ray's had promised. A restaurant 3 streets from the residence, warm inside, full of noise, smelling of things Cass could not identify, and her list said were safe to eat. Vasquez ordered for the table with the confidence of a man who ate here regularly. Obi had her device out until Vasquez gently pushed it face down without comment, and she allowed this in the way people allow small corrections from people they respect. There were 2 others from the transit team, an older man named Drummond who talked with his hands and had a laugh that arrived before the joke did. A quieter woman introduced as senior advisor Crane, who sat at the end of the table and listened more than she spoke. The food came. It was even through the filter of a Veth digestive system that had been carefully briefed on what was safe, interesting, layered in ways she hadn't expected. Several of the humans watched her reactions when she tasted things with a particular interested attention of people who are curious how their world lands on someone new to it. The sports argument started before the second course. It was about a team and a decision made by that team's management and whether that decision had been strategically correct. Cass understood perhaps 40% of the specific references. She understood 100% of the energy, passionate, genuinely invested, occasionally loud, absolutely unresolved, because these things never resolve, which Cass suspected was partly the point. Prith listened with his hands wrapped around a cup of something warm he'd been given after confirming it was safe. His expression was that of a man watching a weather phenomenon he has read about but never personally experienced. Crane, the quiet one, caught Kess's eye during the argument and smiled slightly. The smile of someone watching something they've seen many times and still find worth watching. You stopped in the square today, Crane said, not a question. Yes, Kess said, the monument. I saw it in Director Vask's as his notes from your walk. She was quiet for a moment. The argument continued around them. Drummond was making a case that involved both hands and a bread roll. First time most visitors stop there. Some don't notice it at all. It's hard to miss, Cass said. You'd be surprised. Crane turned her cup slowly in her hands. What did you make of it? Cass considered how to answer honestly. I made of it, she said, that I have had the wrong picture of your species for my entire career, and possibly that the entire collective has the wrong picture, and that the correct picture is, she paused, more complicated than I had preparation for. Crane nodded slowly. The monument was put there so people don't forget what complicated looks like, she said, not as a warning, as a reference point. She looked at her cup. We lost a lot. We've lost a lot a few times over in our history, different ways each time. The argument at the other end of the table peaked and broke into laughter. Crane glanced at it with something that might have been affection. We're still here, though. She said it the same way Vasquez had said. We rebuilt. Not a boast, just a fact. A fact they had apparently made their peace with on some level Cass couldn't fully access because she hadn't lived it. And they had. Still here, though. 3 words. They sat in the warm noise of the restaurant, and Cass thought about the blank space on the map, the white silence that every civilization in the known galaxy had agreed to leave untouched, and for the first time she thought she understood it. Not as a warning, as an acknowledgement. Some things you leave space for, not because you're afraid of them, but because you recognize that they don't need your labels to exist. Still here. After everything. Still here. The transit department building was 6 stories of pale concrete and glass that caught the morning light and held it. Inside it smelled like coffee. This was, Cass had learned in the last 20 hours, the default smell of any human workspace, a sharp roasted smell that came from a dark liquid they consumed in quantities that suggested either addiction or love. Possibly both. She had been offered a cup 3 times since arriving in the capital and had declined 3 times. Politely, because it was on the not safe list for Veth biology. Prith had asked the previous evening whether humans knew they drank that much of it. Vasquez had laughed for a longer time than the question seemed to warrant. The meeting room was on the 4th Floor, large windows, a long table, chairs that were clearly standard issue but had been supplemented at one end with seating alternatives for non-human guests. Kess recognized Veth appropriate furniture, which meant they had done this before or had prepared carefully, or both. Vasquez was already there when she arrived, along with Obi, Crane, and Drummond, plus 3 people she hadn't met yet, a woman introduced as Transit Director Holloway, her own version of a senior official, direct and spare in her movements, a man named Chen from what was called the Legal Framework Office, and an older human named Bautista, who was introduced simply as an advisor, without further specification, and whose role Kess noted and filed. Bautista was the one who interested her. He was perhaps the oldest human she had seen in person, gray-haired, unhurried, with the quality of a man who had stopped needing to prove anything some years ago and found the experience restful. He sat to one side of the main table, not at the head, not integrated into the official line, the advisory position, the one who watches. He watched Kess the way she was watching him. She decided she would pay close attention to anything he said. The formal opening took 20 minutes. Holloway ran it. She was precise and efficient and clearly had no interest in ceremony beyond whatever minimum was necessary to establish the record. Credentials confirmed, authorization verified, the formal diplomatic status of the meeting logged. All of it done with the brisk thoroughness of someone who considers process a tool, not a ritual. Then they got to the actual question. The transit corridor, the third arm, the route that shaved 4 months off half the collective's trade traffic and happened to run through the blank space on the map. Cass laid it out, the economics, the trade volume, the proposed terms, transit fees, notification protocols, traffic management, emergency procedures. She had spent 3 weeks preparing this case. It was thorough. It was reasonable. She had anticipated 27 possible objections and prepared responses to each. Holloway listened without interrupting. When Cass finished, Holloway looked at her notes for a moment, then looked up. The corridor itself isn't a problem, she said. The route you're proposing stays well outside our inhabited systems. It's essentially deep space. Transit, low traffic from our side. Minimal interface required. She set her pen down. The framework is manageable. Cass waited. There are 3 specific points we'll need to work through in detail. Holloway continued. Notification lead time, because our border monitoring has particular sensitivities. We'll need to account for emergency diversion protocols, because we want clarity on what happens if a vessel has to deviate from the corridor under distress, and she paused very slightly. The historical access clause. Clarify that last one, Cass said. Holloway glanced briefly at Bautista. Bautista leaned forward. His voice was easy, the voice of a man who has explained something many times and long ago stopped finding it difficult. The historical access clause refers to a standard provision we include in any transit agreement, he said. It states that the rights granted under the agreement do not extend to unregistered access, unannounced entry, or any vessel not included in the prior notification window. A pause. It also includes a clause about what happens in the event of violation. What happens, Cass said. He looked at her with the patient eyes of a man waiting for a student to connect something they already have all the pieces for. The same thing that always happens, he said. The room was quiet. Cass looked at the table at her own prepared notes at the clean pale light coming in through the fourth floor windows. The Dorati survey team, she said. Nobody in the room reacted with surprise, nobody tensed, nobody reached for different language. Holloway said, yes. 12 ships, Cass said, no prior contact, no notification. They entered your space on a survey mandate from their own government. They entered our space, Holloway said, without contact, without notification, and without identification. Our border monitoring flagged them as unregistered. Our protocols at that time, a fractional pause, were somewhat less refined than they are now. The response was significant. One ship came back, Cass said. Yes. And the pilot didn't speak about it for 3 years. Holloway looked at her steadily. The pilot was present for the response. I wasn't there. This was 80 years ago, but I've read the record. She was quiet for a moment. She came back because she was the one who managed to get a proper identification signal out in time. Our systems recognized it as a civilian science vessel. The response was interrupted. Interrupted. Cass thought about that word doing the work of several sentences. It wasn't going to say. And the other 11 ships, Cass said. Our systems did not receive identification from them in time. Holloway said, the record is sealed at that classification level. What I can tell you is that the response, once triggered, was automatic and fast, and our protocols have since been significantly revised to include more time for identification at the front. And she looked directly at Cass, because that incident was not something any of us wanted to have happen then or now. Cass said nothing. Prith beside her had stopped moving entirely. He was looking at the table. The historical access clause, Cass said, finally, is essentially a formal statement that what happened to the Dorati will not happen to any vessel operating under this agreement. That's correct, Bautista said, because any vessel operating under this agreement will be registered, identified, and included in the prior notification window. Our systems will recognize them. The automatic response protocols will not trigger, and if a vessel deviates from the corridor without prior notification, then it is, from the perspective of our systems, an unregistered, unidentified vessel crossing our border. He said it simply. The clause doesn't create that outcome, it documents it so there's no ambiguity. Chen, the legal framework officer, slid a document across the table. The clause itself is 4 paragraphs. It's specific. We'd recommend your legal team review it in full, but the core of it is clear enough to read plainly. Cass picked it up. She read it. It was, as Chen said, specific, clear. No ambiguity in the language, the kind of document that had been refined over time, probably through multiple similar negotiations, until every edge case had been addressed and every possible misunderstanding had been preempted. A document written by people who had learned the hard way that misunderstandings in this particular area had consequences nobody wanted. They broke for an hour at midday. Vasquez took them to a small room off the main corridor where food had been laid out. A selection that Cass noticed had been organized around the Veth safe. Food list she'd submitted on arrival. Someone had put labels on everything. Small, handwritten labels identifying each item and noting its status. Someone had done this carefully. She stood at the food table and felt, in a way she had not expected to feel it, that she was being looked after. Prith picked up a labeled item, checked. It set it down, picked up another. They knew, he said quietly, about the Dorothy, the full picture. Yes. And they told us. Yes. He looked at his food. They didn't have to do that. No, Cass said, they didn't. They could have given us the clause. Without the context, let us figure it out or not. They could have. He was quiet. Why didn't they? Cass thought about Crane's words at dinner. The monument put there so people don't forget what complicated looks like, not as a warning, as a reference point, because they don't want it to happen again, she said, to anyone including us. Prith picked up the item again, looked at the handwritten label, and finally ate it. He chewed thoughtfully. The sealed record, he said, on our side in the collective's archives. Yes. It's sealed because the Dorothy government didn't want it known that they sent 12 ships into another civilization's space without making contact first, he said, not because the humans asked for it to be sealed. Almost certainly, Cass said. So the story that reached everyone was humans danger blank space stay back. He set down his plate. And the actual story was don't go into someone's home without knocking. And if you do go in without knocking, Cass said, be aware that the people inside have a very fast and very final way of dealing with what looks like an intrusion. He thought about this. That's almost reasonable, he said. It is reasonable, Cass said, by their own logic from their own history, given what they've been through. It is completely reasonable. She looked out the small window at the city outside. They lost a third of their population to things that came from within, things that didn't knock either. The room was quiet. They built protocols, Prith said. Slowly, automatic ones, because when something is coming at you fast, you don't always have time to think. Yes. And the protocols don't distinguish between a military ship and a science ship, not without an identification signal. Cass said, not without the notification. That's the whole point of the clause. She turned from the window. The clause is not a threat, it's instructions. The afternoon session went 4 hours. The notification lead time was agreed at 72 standard hours, with exceptions for emergency rerouting that both sides found acceptable. The emergency diversion protocol took longer. Chen was precise and patient, and Kess's own legal preparation served her well here, and they reached a draft framework that all parties flagged for formal review but considered workable. The historical access clause was signed as presented. 4 paragraphs, specific, clear. Kess signed her name at the bottom with the even hand of someone who has read document fully and understands exactly what they are agreeing to. When it was done, Holloway sat back in her chair with the expression of a person who has completed something that needed completing. The full agreement goes to both councils for ratification, she said. Assuming ratification, and we expect it will go through on our side, provisional transit can begin within 60 days. The Directorate will be pleased, Kess said. 60 days is fast for something this size, Holloway said. It wasn't quite a Boast more like a statement of position. I'm aware, Kes said. Something passed between them, brief. The mutual recognition of two people who understand exactly what they're doing and do it well. Vasquez was writing something in his notebook at the end of the table. Drummond had pushed his chair back and was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been sitting down for 4 hours and is thinking about this more than he wants to. Obi was on her device, but her eyes were moving quickly in a way that suggested work rather than distraction. Batista had been quiet for most of the afternoon session. He had spoken 3 times, once to clarify a point in the notification protocol, once to suggest a wording change in the diversion clause that made it cleaner, once to answer a direct question from Prith about the classification level of incident reports under the new agreement. Each time his contributions had been precise, minimal, exactly sufficient. Now he looked at Kes across the table. "Can I ask you something?" he said, "not for the record." "Go ahead," Kes said. "The blank space on your maps," he said. It without weight, just a question. "And GT, snorts. And GT, did anyone back home try to talk you out of coming here because of it?" Kes looked at him. "Several people." "What did they say?" "That it was dangerous, that there were precedents for things going wrong, that the sealed records meant something should be left sealed," she considered. "That the blank space was blank for a reason." Batista nodded slowly. "And what do you think now?" Kes thought about Orif's window, about Prith's wordless alarm, about the briefing packet's careful language, and the Marin word for a rock that keeps rolling, and the Kavari shudder, and 4 species that tested the limit once and never tried again. About the monument in the square, about 3 words still here, though. About the handwritten labels on the food. "I think the blank space is blank," she said, "because your neighbors looked at you and couldn't find a category for you. And when something doesn't fit a category, the easiest response is to leave it unnamed and give it room." Batista was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous read," he said. "It's also partly fear," Cass said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "I know," he said. He looked at the document on the table between them, the signed clause, the agreement they'd built over 8 hours across 2 days. "That's always been the thing we've never quite figured out how to fix. We're not trying to scare anyone, we're just," he stopped, thought, "we're just us." "I know," Cass said. And she did. That was the thing she would carry back with her, not the clause, not the protocols, not even the image of the monument and the smooth stone under her feet. Just that. "We're just us," said without apology, without performance, without any awareness that us was the thing that made a blank space on every map in the known galaxy. They were just people who had lost a great deal and kept going and built protocols for the border and put plants on windowsills and argued about sports at dinner, and all of those things were true at the same time as the thing that made 4 civilizations step back and decide that once was enough. Both things, the same people, the same history. Cass looked at the signed document on the table and thought, the gap between the blank space and the thing that fills it is smaller than the galaxy believes. Then she thought, maybe that's the most important thing to bring home. They left the next morning. Vasquez saw them to the transport with the easy courtesy he'd shown throughout. No ceremony, no formal farewell address. Just a handshake and a suggestion that next time she came in, she should try the food on the south side of the city, which was better than what they'd had at dinner. Obi didn't look up from her device, but she said safe travels with enough sincerity that it landed. Drummond gave Prith a short and enthusiastic summary of the correct position on the sports argument on the grounds that Prith had looked like he was following it during dinner and deserved the full conclusion. Prith listened with the attentiveness of a man who understands none of the specifics and every bit of the energy. Crane shook Kess's hand last. The clause, she said, you read it carefully. I always read carefully, Kess said. I know Vasquez mentioned it. She held Kess's hand for a moment longer. Not everyone does. Some people sign things because they want the outcome and they don't want to look at what the outcome requires. She released her hand. You looked. It seemed important to look, Kess said. Crane nodded once. Come back, she said, when the corridors running come through properly. The transport lifted. Below, the city spread in every direction, reaching, filling, building. While it lived, the monuments small and dark in the central square, the unnamed stars of human space burning outside every window of every ship and station that had no label for them on any official chart. Prith sat beside Kess and looked down as the city shrank. We should talk about what we're going to say in the report, he said. Yes, Kess said, we should. Are we going to say all of it? Kess looked at the city until it was gone and there was only sky and then only dark and then stars. We're going to say enough of it, she said. Prith was quiet. The part about the Durathi, he said. Finally, yes. The directorate is not going to like that part. No, she said, they're not. The transport crossed the border. The coordinate numbers ticked back into existence on the console. Star names reasserted themselves. The galaxies careful catalog resumed as if it had never paused. Kess watched the numbers come back. She thought somewhere on the other side of that line, someone has a map with our space left blank, not as a warning, just left blank, because we never told them where we were. The thought sat with her, large and uncomfortable and important all the way home. The collective's central archive smelled like paper and cold air and the particular stillness of a place where important things are stored and rarely touched. Cass had worked here for 15 years. She knew every quarter. She knew which reading lamps flickered in the east wing and which filing clerks arrived early and which senior archivists took their afternoon break at the same bench outside the north entrance every single day, regardless of weather, as if consistency itself were a form of prayer. She had never come back from an assignment and found the archive strange. She found it strange now. Not different, it was exactly what it had always been. The same pale walls, the same hum of the climate control system, the same neat rows of cataloged knowledge stretching back 600 years of careful Veth accumulation. It was exactly what it had always been. That was the problem. She sat at her desk on the second floor and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she opened the report. The directorate had given her 10 days to file. She filed in 6 because the work was already done in her head and because sitting with it felt worse than writing it. The report was thorough. That was her nature and her training, and she didn't know how to be otherwise, even when thorough meant documenting things that would sit poorly with the people who read them. Section 1, the Transit Agreement. Terms, Timeline, Protocol, Framework. Clause Summary. This part was straightforward. The Directorate would be pleased. 4 months shaved off the trade route, 60 days to provisional transit, a legal framework clear enough to hold. She wrote this section first because it was clean and uncomplicated, and she needed a place to start. Section 2, Observations on Human Governance and Social Structure. She wrote what she had seen, the city that built while it lived, the varied population, the ease with which humans occupied shared spaces, the food and the plants and the sports arguments and the handwritten labels. She wrote it plainly, the way she always wrote field observations, specifically, without editorializing. Let the details speak. She wrote about the monument. She spent more time on the monument than anything else in that section. The smooth pale stone, the words at the base, the image that might have been a wave or a hand. She wrote what Vasquez had told her, and she wrote what the square looked like around it, and she wrote Crane's sentence about her grandmother, because that sentence contained something that 2 paragraphs of analysis could not. Section 3, the Dorothy Incident. She stopped before she wrote it, sat with the blank space on the page, and thought about Prith's voice on the transport. The Directorate is not going to like that part. And then she thought about Bautista and Crane and the signed document and the handwritten labels, and she wrote it, all of it. The 12 ships entering human space without prior contact or identification. The human border monitoring flagging them as unregistered. The automatic response protocols. The 11 ships that didn't get an identification signal out in time. The 1 pilot who did. 3 years of silence. The sealed record on the collective side, sealed not by human request, but by Dorothy. Embarrassment. She did not soften any of it. She wrote in the margin in a note, clearly marked as personal observation rather than official record, the humans did not ask us to seal anything. We sealed it ourselves. The story we have told ourselves for 80 years, blank space. Danger, stay back, is a story we built on top of a much simpler truth, which is they responded to what looked like an intrusion because that is what their history taught them to do, and we were not careful enough to knock. She read it back, left it in. Then she wrote Section 4. Section 4 was the hardest. It was titled in the official Directorate format, Recommendations and Strategic Observations. In practice, it was the section where a returning diplomat was expected to say, "Here is what we should do now, and here is why." Cass had written this section of many reports. She was good at it. She knew how to balance the political reality of what the Directorate would accept against the diplomatic reality of what was actually true, and she knew how to find the path between them that served both without sacrificing either. This time the path was narrow. She wrote about the transit agreements, implications, what it meant that humans had agreed at all, what it said about their interest in broader economic integration, what further agreements might become possible if this one worked. She wrote about the distinction between human space being sealed and human space being closed, and argued clearly that it had never been truly closed, only uncontacted, and that the difference mattered in practical terms. She wrote about the border protocols, the notification requirements, the historical access clause. She framed these accurately as standard security infrastructure, no different in principle from any other civilization's border controls, distinguished only by the speed and finality of what happened when they were triggered, which was, she wrote, a function of human history and human psychology, and was not going to change and should be understood and respected rather than challenged. She made 3 formal recommendations. 1. Ratify the transit agreement and proceed to corridor access within the agreed timeline. 2. Begin preliminary diplomatic groundwork for a broader contact framework. Not a full treaty, not yet, but the structured introduction that should have happened 300 years ago and hadn't because of institutional reluctance, and later the distorted picture built on the sealed Durathi record. 3. Unseal the Durathi incident record. This one she knew would be the problem. She wrote the argument for it carefully. The sealed record had created a false understanding that persisted across 3 centuries and had shaped every diplomatic and military calculation the collective had made regarding human space in that entire period. Decisions made on a false picture were structurally compromised. The story the collective told itself, blank space, danger, stay back, was not false exactly, but it was incomplete in ways that changed its meaning. The full picture, she argued, was not more frightening than the partial one. It was, in several important ways, less frightening, and a civilization that understood the full picture was equipped to behave correctly. A civilization that understood only the partial picture was navigating by instinct and borrowed fear. She read Section 4 back twice. Then she submitted the report. The directorate response came in 3 days. They were pleased about the transit agreement. She had expected this. They were concerned about Section 3. She had expected this too. They requested a formal presentation to the senior council before any action was taken on recommendations 2 and 3. She had expected this. The council chamber was a large room that had been designed at some point in the collective's history to feel significant. High ceiling, long table, the kind of deliberate architecture that says decisions made here matter. Kess had been in this room 4 times before. She had always found it slightly excessive. Today she found it exactly right for what she needed to do. There were 9 senior council members. She knew 5 of them personally, the other 4 by reputation and record. They were all 9 serious and competent and deeply protective of institutional stability, which was both their strength and, on certain days, their limitation. She presented the transit agreement. First 20 minutes, they asked questions, good questions, precise, focused on the practical implications. She answered fully. The agreement was approved for ratification at the end of that section of the meeting, with 2 minor requests for additional documentation that she had anticipated and already prepared. Then she moved to Section 3. She told them what had actually happened to the Durathi survey team. She told it plainly, no softening, no framing that made it easier to receive. She had decided on the transport home that the only way to do this was directly, because indirect was how the problem had survived 80 years, and indirect was how it would survive Another 80 if she let it. The room was quiet when she finished. Council member Aaron, who was the eldest, and had been on this council for 22 years, said, "The Dorathi government has known this the entire time." "Yes," Kes said. "And they chose to frame the incident in terms that protected their own decision-making," Kes said. "Going in without contact was their call. The outcome was documentation of what happens when you make that call. They preferred not to have that documented publicly." "And the humans," said council member Soth, who was younger and faster and was already 2 steps ahead, "they never contradicted the story. They never confirmed it either. There's no record of any human government issuing any public statement about the incident at all." Kes paused. "They treated it as an internal security matter. They responded to what looked like an unauthorized border crossing. Then they went back to their business." A long silence. "They weren't trying to send a message," Aaron said slowly. "No," Kes said. "There was no intention to intimidate the wider galaxy." "The outcome was intimidating," Kes said. "The intention was self-contained. They protected their border, the story that grew around it. Blank space. Stay back. Do not approach. That story was built by everyone else, not by them." The council looked at each other. Council member Veth, no relation to the species name, just an old family name that caused constant minor confusion, leaned forward. She was the cautious one, the one who always found the reason to wait. "If we unseal the record," she said, "it creates a diplomatic situation with the Dorathi." "Yes," Kes said. "They will not want this public." "No. And yet you recommend it." "I recommend it because every calculation we have made about human space for 80 years has been built on incomplete information," Kes said, "and because I believe the transit agreement is the first step in something larger, and that larger thing will not hold if it's built on the same incomplete ground." Council member Veth looked at her for a long moment. The room held itself still. "We'll discuss it," Aaron said, the words of a chairman moving past a difficult thing to the next thing without resolving the difficult thing. "The third recommendation, the contact framework." "Yes," Kes said. "You believe broader diplomatic engagement is viable." "I believe it's overdue," Kes said, "by roughly 300 years." A small shift in the room. "Not quite. Discomfort, the thing that precedes recalibration." "And the blank space on the map," said Soth. He leaned his elbows on the table. His eyes were direct. "Your report doesn't address it formally." "No," Kes said. "Should it be updated now that we have an agreement, now that we have coordinates, transit routes, contact information? We have enough data to begin charting their space properly." Cass had known this question was coming. She had spent 6 days preparing the transit agreement report and 3 days preparing for this room, and most of that time had not been spent on the transit agreement. It had been spent on this. She thought about the map in Ray's folder, the regional overview with their side left blank, not labeled, not warned against, just open space because no one had told them where to look. She thought about Crane's grandmother and her city that smelled like stubbornness, about the monuments, smooth stone, and the crowds that wore it smooth without knowing they were doing it, about Batista's face when he said, "We're just us," with no awareness that us was the thing that stopped the whole galaxy at the edge of a line. She thought about Orith's window, turned deliberately away. She thought about the Kavari shutter, the quick, controlled one that meant some things are better not fully named. She thought about the one thing that had stayed with her underneath everything else since the moment she walked through the arrivals terminal, and the city noise hit her like a wall. They were not frightening because they were dangerous. They were frightening because the danger was incidental, a byproduct, the thing that happened when you pushed past the warmth and the plants in the restaurant, dinners and the handwritten labels, and kept pushing until you found the place where their history had taught them to stop asking questions and simply respond. And then they were very fast, and they did not stop, and they remembered both things, the same people, the same history, and the rest of the galaxy had looked both things and drawn a line and end. The line wasn't wrong, it was just incomplete. It was the fear without the understanding, the warning without the instruction. Don't go in without knocking. That was all the line had ever needed to say. She looked at Soth. No, she said. The room waited. The map should stay as it is, she said. Blank. We have the data now, Soth said. Transit corridor alone gives us. The transit corridor gives us a corridor, Cass said. It does not give us their space. They gave us access to a specific route for a specific purpose, under specific conditions, and those conditions include the historical access clause, which is clear about what happens to vessels operating outside the registered framework. She let that land. We chart our side. We leave theirs unmarked because it is theirs to mark. It's a practical inconvenience, Soth said, not combatively, working through it. It's a correct inconvenience, Cass said, if we want to know more of their space, their systems, their worlds, their actual geography. We ask them the way we should have asked 300 years ago, before we decided that blank space was easier than conversation. A wren was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been on a council for 22 years and has occasionally across that time had the experience of someone saying the correct thing in the correct room at the correct moment. He recognized it. The map stays as it is, he said, not a question, a settlement. The map stays as it is, Cass said. And we begin the conversation that fills it in properly over time through contact, through the kind of exchange that the transit agreement is the beginning of. The room was quiet. Outside the chamber's high windows, the sky above the archive district was pale and clean and mapped to a precision of several decimal places. Every building tagged, every street cataloged, every coordinate logged. The collective 600-year record of the world it stood on. Precise, thorough, complete. And on the other side of the border that nobody had ever formally named, a city spread across a landscape like water, finding its level, building while it lived, its monument standing in a square worn smooth by feet that belonged to people who had lost a third of everything and were still here. Not on any map. Not labeled. Not warned against. Just there, as they had always been, waiting with the easy patience of people who have outlasted worse things than being unknown, for someone to come to the border and simply knock. Kess walked out of the council chamber and into the corridor, and Prith fell into step beside her the way he always did, folder in hand, already thinking about the next thing that needed doing. How did it go? He asked. The agreement is ratified, she said. And the rest? Ongoing, she kept walking. They'll debate the Durathi record for a while. They'll debate the contact framework. That's what councils do. And the map. She thought about the white space. The clean absence at the center of 600. Years of careful work, the gap that wasn't a gap, that was full of cities. And monuments and restaurants and small plants on windowsills and fast, decisive border systems that had been built out of old pain and older patience. The map stays the same, she said. Prith was quiet. Good, he said finally. She looked at him. I thought about it on the way back. He said simply, some things you leave room for, you don't label them, you just leave the room and you learn to mean it. Honestly, he held his folder against his chest. The habit he had when he was making his peace with something, the map is honest, blank is honest, we don't know that space, we're beginning to, but we don't, so the map should say what's true. Cass looked at him for a moment. When did you get wise? She said. Somewhere over the border, he said. Coming back. They walked out of the archives into the pale afternoon, and the city went about itself around them, and the stars were already out in the east, faint and early, each one named and tagged in the great careful record of the known galaxy. Every star, except the ones that didn't need anyone else's name. Those burned just the same.